The NBA is in a fantastic place right now in terms of the future of the league. So I wanted to go ahead and rank every single young core around the league. I'm picking 3 players from every team. They all have to be 25 years old or younger and splitting them each into different tiers based off what I think the future of those 3 guys on that roster is going to look like. We begin with the bottom tier, the D tier, the absolute worst of the worst, and that starts with the LA Clippers. They basically have Zubats, Terrence Mann, who I like, and Brandon Boston, who I know a lot of other people like as well, but none of those guys are going to be all-star level players at any point in their career moving forward. It doesn't look like, at least. And best case, those are 3 like really solid role players, and none of them really inspire a ton of upside. It's very obvious why they're in the bottom tier. Next up, the Brooklyn Nets, who have Nick Claxton, Cam Thomas, and Day'Ron Sharpe. Cam Thomas, who I like as a scorer, Nick Claxton, who can be an interesting big at times, and Day'Ron Sharpe, who barely played last year, none of which, again, inspire a ton of confidence in the future of this team. The Milwaukee Bucks have 1 player listed here because they basically don't have players that are 25 and under. They obviously are going to be in the bottom tier. The Lakers have Thomas Bryant, Lonnie Walker, and the inevitable Talen Horton-Tucker. I don't view any of these guys as fantastic assets moving forward, nor do I view any of them as high upside players moving forward, so they obviously are in the bottom tier. And then the Washington Wizards, who have Johnny Davis, who they just drafted, Denny, and then Daniel Gafford. I really like Daniel Gafford, and I think Denny is better than most people think as well, especially defensively. I think ultimately he's going to be a solid player, but again, no stars to be found there. That, to me, is by far the easiest tier to rank in this entire video. We move on now to the C tier, which begins with the Chicago Bulls. Here I have Lonzo, Patrick Williams, and I have Ayo Dosunmu. I know that Kobe White could be listed here as well. Zach LaVine is too old. Again, remember, it's 25 and under here. And even though I really like Lonzo, the health stuff is concerning, and Patrick Williams has really not shown a ton to begin his career in terms of staying on the floor. I still think there's upside and potential there, which is why they're in the C tier, but he needs to show us a little bit more for them to be higher than this. Next up is Portland, who I struggled with a little bit because I like Anthony Simons. Shaedon Sharpe is interesting as a guy that just drafted, and Nasir Little looks pretty good as well, but none of these guys project, in my opinion, as a future star, despite how good Simons was last year. And when you look at the centerpiece guys that are in the B tier, you'll understand why Anthony Simons wasn't enough to put them up in the B tier. Side note really quick, this is just players. This is not a futures video. This is not considering draft picks. It's just the 3 players listed here as a part of their young core. Next up, maybe a bit of a surprise for some of you, the Denver Nuggets. I put them here even though they have Michael Porter Jr., Bones Highland, and the recently drafted Christian Braun. The MPJ thing makes me nervous. The contract makes me nervous. The injury stuff, the back injury, all that, and Bones Highland, even as much as he was pretty good as a rookie, is not enough for me to bump them up any higher than this. If MPJ has a really great season this year, obviously they're going to be listed higher, and Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic no longer qualify with that 25 and under number that I listed earlier. Next up, the San Antonio Spurs. I really struggled with where to put them because they have a lot of young guys, but when you're, kind of restricting it to just 3 players here, it doesn't look as impressive. So Josh Primo, who they drafted last year, Keldon Johnson, who they just gave an extension to, and Sohan, who they just drafted this year as well. Individually, I like Sohan, I like Keldon Johnson. Primo has to show me a little bit more here, but again, maybe there's some upside there, and there is plenty of depth amongst those 3 players, but not enough to put them up another tier. And then to finish out the C tier is the Philadelphia 76ers. And I like Tyrese Maxey, and him alone almost caused me to put them in the B tier. They traded for DeAnthony Melton, who I like. Matisse Thybulle is still there, but ultimately, Tyrese Maxey would have to become like a future all-star caliber player for them to be higher than this for me. And right now, as much as I like him, I'm not willing to put him in that category quite yet. Now we move on to the really interesting categories. We start with the B tier, and it begins with the Charlotte Hornets. So I almost put them in the C tier because outside of LaMelo, there's not much there. They just drafted Mark Williams, like PJ Washington is there, but there's really not a whole lot going on. But when I had them in the C tier and I looked at LaMelo compared to everybody else that was in that tier, it felt like they needed to be bumped up a little bit just because of the future that he kind of represents for them. And so ultimately they ended up in the B tier. Another side note, these are not ranked within the tiers. These are just, you're in the B tier. It doesn't matter if I talk about you first or last. You're all pretty much on the same level in my eyes. Next up now is the New York Knicks, who have the recently signed Jalen Brunson, the recently re-signed Mitchell Robinson, as well as RJ Barrett. Maybe you could make the argument that they should be bumped up a little bit higher here as a result of whatever you think the future of RJ Barrett is, and then the recently signed Jalen Brunson. For me, this didn't inspire a ton of confidence in me, so I put them in the B tier. Next up is Sacramento, another team that I struggle with a little bit here. It depends entirely on how much you're buying Keegan Murray's Summer League performance, how much you like Kevin Huerter, and how much you like De'Aaron Fox. I'm kind of like in the middle on all 3 of those guys. So ultimately, I put them in the B tier. But if you want to try and make an argument that because Keegan Murray was awesome in Summer League and De'Aaron Fox was really good in the second half of last season, if you want to make the argument to put them in the A tier, I think there's a solid case to be made. I just decided not to. Next up is Indiana, who I wanted to put higher because I really like Tyrese Halliburton, and then Mathurin, who they just drafted as well, I think is going to be a good player for them. But one of the issues is Chris Duarte is already 25 years old, even though that he was recently drafted. And again, unless it's Halliburton, I don't know where the All-NBA, All-Star level potential comes here without having seen Mathurin actually play in an NBA environment yet. So I put them in the B tier. And then last up in this tier is the Golden State Warriors, who I wish I could have put higher. Wiggins doesn't qualify here, and there's a lot of different guys you can pick from. I went with Wiseman over Moody. If you want to put Moody in here, that's fine. Kuminga, Poole, all three of those guys are really good, but again, Poole's shown to be a solid scorer. Wiseman has barely played, and Kuminga, although he was impressive when he did play last year, wasn't a huge part of the rotation, so despite how young he is, I'm going to put them in the B tier as well. Now we move on to, these are the big ones here. Like, these are the brightest, some of the brightest like futures in the league, and or just some of the best young cores in the entire league. In the A tier, we begin with the Miami Heat. Tyler Hero, Bam Adebayo, and then the recently drafted Nikola Jovic. And I'm not the biggest Tyler Hero guy. Like, I like his game and I understand the benefits that he provides. For me, this has a lot to do with Bam Adebayo, what he provides on both ends of the floor and what I think he can continue to grow into. I don't think he's ever going to be an MVP caliber guy or number one option offensively, but I think he fits so well within so many different structures. And given the fact that there are two really, really good players in this group of three, I think that necessitated Miami being in the A tier. If you're lower on Hero and Bam than I am, maybe you can make the case for them to be in that B tier right alongside maybe Golden State to this point in the list. Next up now, I have the Houston Rockets. These are all the young guys. I think Houston, if you were allowed to in this exercise have like 6 players as a part of your young core, they might have been an S tier team, but Jalen Green's really good. Jabari Smith, that they just drafted, I think is gonna be good. And then I put Şengün here. You can pick like 4 other players that you want to put here if you'd like to. Tari Eason, Jayshawn Tate, whatever the case may be. I really like their core. Again, it's just about seeing something out of Jabari Smith this season that makes me really, really excited. And at that point, you could probably make the argument for them to be in the very top tier. We move on now to the Detroit Pistons, who have Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, and Jalen Duren. For me, the only reason they're not in the S tier is because they have 2 rookies in this top 3, and they have other guys you can put in there. Sadiq Bey, obviously, if you'd like to, that's fine. But I really like Cade. I like how Ivey fits alongside him, and I think Duren is going to be a nice player for them at the 5 as well. It's just about, we need to see Ivey and Duren in an NBA environment. I keep saying that throughout the video. I'm not just going to assume that these guys are going to be awesome NBA players based off their college evaluations in terms of putting them in that S tier. So for me, the Pistons are very, very solidly in the A tier. Next up is the Utah Jazz, a team I had difficulty placing, but because of Donovan Mitchell, they're going to be in the A tier here alongside Jared Vanderbilt and Malik Beasley. If you had put Donovan Mitchell in the B tier and you look at the other teams and the kind of top players that are in that tier, he would have been a little bit out of place in my opinion. So that's why they ended up being bumped up to the A tier. I initially had them in B and then bumped them up to A. Toronto is next up now. They have Gary Trent, OG, and of course, Scottie Barnes. Now, I like OG. I like Gary Trent. This is a very Scottie Barnes centric ranking. If you take Scottie out of this and put in Van Fleet, or just pick another 25 and under player. I don't even know if Van Fleet is 25 or younger, probably not. If you take Scottie out of this and put in just, some random wing on their roster, they're maybe in the B tier, but more than likely maybe even all the way down in the C tier, as much as I like OG and Gary Trent. But I think Scottie Barnes has all NBA potential moving forward, and that bumps them all the way up to the A tier, with the possibility over the next season or two for him to maybe put them all the way up into the S tier, depending on how good he ends up becoming. Next up now is Minnesota, who has Jaden McDaniels. Naz Reid is who I put as their 3rd, but then of course the centerpiece of this is Anthony Edwards. And that's how much I like Anthony Edwards. That's how much I believe in him, because the other 2 guys do not inspire much confidence in terms of being an A tier team. But you could honestly make the argument that Anthony Edwards, given how young he is actually a guy that should elevate them all the way to the S tier. But when you see the centerpieces that are in the S tier, you're going to start to think, hey, maybe he belongs a little bit more in the A. And so that is where I put them. Last up now in the A tier is the Orlando Magic. I have Paolo, Franz, and then I put Wendell Carter Jr. You can put whoever you want to there. Jonathan Isaac, Cole Anthony, Jalen Suggs, Markelle Fultz. Again, just like Houston, if you expanded this to like 7 players, Orlando's probably in the S tier in comparison to a lot of other teams. But because it's only 3 guys and because Paolo hasn't played yet, I'm going to put them in the A tier with the very distinct possibility of bumping them up later on based off how Paolo looks this season. I really like Franz. I think Wendell Carter actually had a really intriguing season alongside some of their other bigs last year. I'm excited to see how that group continues to grow and develop. Which leads us now to the S tier, the top 8 young cores in the entire league. If you look at the S and the A tier, you can start to see there are a ton of really, really bright futures in the league, beginning with the Phoenix Suns. Now, I initially had them in the A tier, and I decided to bump them up one because I didn't realize Devin Booker is still 25 years old. Like, I thought that it was like Bridges, Ayton, like Cam Johnson, or somebody else. But the fact that Devin Booker's in here, I don't think they can be lower than an S tier, despite the collapse in the playoffs and Chris Paul getting older, obviously, as a team. When you're just looking at the young core of Ayton, Bridges, and Booker, I think they have to be in the S tier, and that's why they're there. Next up now was the easiest selection, I think, of the entire video. It's the Boston Celtics. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Robert Williams, a core of 3 players, all of which are 25 and under, all of which are going to continue to get better, and all of which were critical to a team that we just saw go to the finals. You can talk about the young players that are throughout this tier. You can talk about the true superstars that are in this tier. But when you look at like a team that we literally just saw make the finals with a young core of 3 guys, Boston can't be anywhere other than the S tier. Next up now is Dallas, and this is obviously a very Luka-centric ranking. They have Luka, they have Josh Green, they have Jaden Hardy, and like the other 2 guys really don't matter. Like you can like them and you can say, oh, well, they're pretty intriguing, but even if they just didn't exist on the roster, in my opinion, given the fact that Luka's like 23, they still have to be in the very top tier of young cores. Next up is New Orleans, another very easy one. Zion, Brandon Ingram, Herb Jones. Why did they say Herb as in like Herb Jones? Goodness gracious, Tuck. Those 3 guys together are very, very clearly one of the best young cores in the entire league, and from a talent perspective, potentially the best young core in the entire league. Next up now is OKC, who have SGA, Josh Giddey, and then Chet. And I know that Chet hasn't played yet, and I kind of deducted points from other teams to this point as a result of that. But even if you took Chet out and you put in like Lou Dort, for example, I still think that SGA and Giddey together, in addition to what Lou Dort brings, puts them in this top tier. But the upside of Chet, I think, really, really solidifies that for them in the S tier. Next up now is Atlanta, who has Trae Young, John Collins / DeAndre Hunter, whoever you want to put there, and then DeJounte Murray, who of course they just brought in. And you can think what you want to, as I do, about the value that they traded in exchange for DeJounte Murray. But in terms of a young core, that is an S tier group when you're looking at an all NBA caliber player in Trae Young, an all-star caliber player in DeJounte Murray, and a very, very good scoring forward in John Collins or DeAndre Hunter as a 2-way defensive player if healthy. They're in the top tier for me. 2 more teams left now. We have the Cleveland Cavaliers. Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, Darius Garland, very, very clearly one of the brightest young futures in the league. A group of 3 guys that fit together, that play well together, and that are really, really good on both ends of the floor collectively. I think Garland can still obviously get better defensively, but when you have Jared Allen and Evan Mobley behind you, you're going to be in a pretty good spot defensively. I love those 3 guys together in Cleveland. And then the last up, of course, is the Memphis Grizzlies. It's Ja, it's Jaren Jackson Jr. I put Desmond Bane here. You could pick 100 other guys on their roster. They've got like 14 NBA players on their team that are really, really good and can play real minutes. They have to, in my opinion, be in the S tier. Now, this wasn't as difficult as some of the other rankings videos that I've done in the past because the rules are much more restrictive, but I'm still interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below in terms of what you disagreed with from this list and where you would have put each of these teams. But that's the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all next time.